All
Hi,
right,
everyone.
Michelle.
Good morning. Michelle Sandoval. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I currently work for the Division of Public and Behavioral Health for rural clinics. I've been a social worker in rural Nevada for over 20 years. It's crazy to say that. My passion is working with youth and families and developing programs that help them be able to access services quickly. In the last 7 years, I've lived in the world of crisis and crisis services, and it's just, again, a passion of mine to be able to get youth and families those services, especially in our rural areas, quickly in the same quality that we have in our urban areas. So it's wonderful to be here today. It's great to see some familiar faces. Hey, Ruby, Melina, Dana, it's good to see you guys.
Hi, I'm Ann Polakowski. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker in Nevada, working with the Division of Child and Family Services. I've been there about 18 and a half years now. I have a particular passion for youth that have experienced trauma. And in 2013 was lucky enough to come across the project of mobile crisis response and stabilization and be able to bring and develop the mobile crisis response team in the state of Nevada, and have been working and operating in that system since 2013. So that was a brand new adventure for me starting then, and it has really grown and been amazing in being able to connect youth and families quickly to mental health support. And I just want to give a shout out to Dana before we get started, because Dana, we borrowed some of your slides and you may not know that. So I wanted to give you credit for, if you see a slide that was yours from a previous presentation with Michelle, it is indeed yours. So I wanted to give you that credit.
I totally quit sharing shamelessly, so no worries. I'm happy. I'm so happy to see both your faces too. Thank you for being here.
I'd like to say we lovingly lifted it, if that's okay. But okay. So we weren't sure who exactly was coming today or how many of y'all would be here. So we have a presentation, but we'd also like to make it interactive, since there's about 50, so it's getting a little bit bigger. But if there's something that you want us to know or a question you would like us to entertain, if you could put it in the chat, Jenna's going to be looking at that chat for us and getting us those questions. So you ready to get started, Michelle?
I am. I just have to, real quick, I have to give Ann a shout out, because not only did she was one of the forefathers of bringing mobile crisis to the state of Nevada and developing it, but she has also been a national trainer for mobile crisis and has trained other states on how to implement mobile crisis. So we are really fortunate to have her expertise here this morning, and I just encourage everyone to soak everything in that she has to say, because she's pretty amazing. Okay, now I'll share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see. So we really wanted to, one of the things that Jen asked for this presentation was what a mental health crisis looks like, tips on what you can do if you run into someone with having a mental health crisis in your schools, and then a little bit about resources that you can use to help with those mental health resources. So the first part, we're really just going to talk about what mental health crisis looks like in children and adolescents, how the brain functions during a mental health crisis. We're also going to give you some statistics about how COVID and the pandemic has affected crisis for youth and adolescents, and specifically in Nevada, but nationwide as well. And then we'll go into some tips about how to intervene and how to help a youth in crisis, and just little things that you can do. And then we'll talk about some resources. Okay, I just got to learn how to advance my screen. Okay.
So crisis is very broadly defined. And so I picked for us 3 definitions that I think are really important. So the American Psychological Association defines crisis as a situation that produces significant cognitive or emotional stress in those that are involved in it. Pretty broad, right? The National Child Trauma Stress Network defines crisis resulting from a trauma as children who develop reactions that persist and affect their daily lives after that traumatic event has ended. Mobile response and stabilization services, so mobile crisis response teams across the country that serve youth and their families, have the broadest definition of all, in my opinion, which is crisis is defined by the individual and family. And what that means is that a family or a youth define their own crisis. And so it's not a rubric, it's not a checklist of, are you suicidal? Are you homicidal? Are you are you experiencing any psychoses? It really is, are you having a situation that you are having difficulty navigating that is causing stress emotionally, cognitively? Has there been a trauma that you are experiencing some crises from, and you need support and you need it now? And that is how we define crisis within the mobile response system. So basically anybody can access it at that point, right? Because you get to define your need.
So we wanted to start off by showing just a short video, and this video talks about trauma, specifically violent trauma, but it talks about how trauma, untreated, can develop into those mental health crises in youth and adolescents, and the importance of intervening. And in the state of Nevada, we pride ourselves on really trying to provide a system of care that is trauma-informed. So a youth who enters mental health services, we really work towards identifying those traumas that they might have experienced in their lives and helping heal from those to prevent further mental health crises. So we're going to do a short video. I'm going to unshare my screen for a second while I pull up the video. And as Jen said in the beginning too, I want to make sure some of, Ann and I will talk about triggers a little bit later in our presentation, but some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about and in this video that you're seeing, it's really real. And it's talking about crisis and youth in crisis and some situations that could cause some distress in you as participants who are viewing it. So again, as Jen said, make sure practice self-care. If you need to step away, we totally understand. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share.
My mother and my brother were murdered.
Michelle, we can just see your calendar, your Outlook. Teams is kind of funky. So it's not the video, it's just your Outlook calendar.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, let's try this again.
Yes.
My mother and my brother were murdered in front of me. He put the gun to my head and he had me beg for my life. I was 10. Just turned 10.
Hard to come out and say that I was a victim and that I was abused, especially when you're little, because it's like a big secret that's always on your back and that you never know when it's going to come out.
The image of my brother falling on that concrete floor and people stepping and just kicking with shoes on his face, I couldn't get that image out of my head.
Trauma is an overwhelming event. It takes away our safety, it creates a sense of helplessness, and it continues to affect our perception of our reality.
Some of the telltale signs of trauma are quite evident. Many of the symptoms, it's not that we don't see them, it's that we don't put together the entire sort of picture of what trauma is. Inability to sleep or interrupted sleep, inability to focus on what's going on, really not able to attend to learning. Adults need to be aware of children who are exposed to violence and intervene early and stop it.
I don't like the environment that I stay in. People getting killed every day, drug deals, getting snatched, raped,
cut up.
Whether it is a child who witnesses violence or a child who is the victim. You can't be fearful and be able to live your normal life. You have to be able to think clearly, and when you're traumatized, you can't do that.
Violence continues then to affect a child in their perception of their community, of their family. The danger is right around the corner. And the brain gets wired to expect danger.
My dad started like actually physically beating me to the point to where I'd go to school covered in bruises. I don't know how many times I've been threatened to be killed by my own dad.
My brother got shot in the head. He didn't make it.
It makes you afraid at times. Makes you feel that, oh my God, you know what? I just lost a friend. I just lost a family member. It just makes you feel that, hey, I could die next. I could be the next one dead.
What trauma does is it triggers what's called the amygdala in the brain, which is our fight, flight, freeze center.
And it truly is a change in the brain and a change in the stress hormones that are flowing through the body.
All our brains have what we call alarms. Because the brain now has been wired for danger and it's triggered into this fight, flight, we don't just get over a traumatic event. It continues to impact us.
I started hearing my mom scream in the middle of the night. They got to the point where he started like beating me and my sisters. I let my anger build up, didn't talk to anybody about it. When you hold everything aside, it's like a bomb and it's like you're ready to explode and just somebody push that last button.
Most kids who've experienced violence oftentimes have experienced multiple types of violence. In the kids we see, the average number of different types of violent trauma is 4. And so complex trauma then affects multiple areas of the brain because it's ongoing.
Maybe it's gang warfare, maybe it's drug use and abuse in the family, maybe it's domestic violence, maybe it's bullying at school. And if there is a layering effect of cumulative violence that changes literally the DNA.
It all started off with a hugging game. He would take us into his room. We would sit on his lap and he would hug us, and we weren't supposed to tell anyone.
I was 5. I would have to leave kindergarten class and go home and have sex with this man who was in his 50s. I remember the long walk home and crying and falling down and having to get back up and walking on.
Child sexual abuse exists in the neighborhood, exists unfortunately at our schools, at our churches, at our homes, everywhere. And there are children out there suffering.
My first assault was in high school. I met a guy at the church and he wanted to be my friend. I thought it'd be great. And instead he assaulted me and I felt very scared.
When you have a child that doesn't get to work through that abuse in an appropriate manner, that abuse doesn't go away. It lives in that child.
Exposure to violence in childhood has been found to be associated with a really unbelievable range of long-term impacts.
Very young children who are exposed to violence many times have difficulty in establishing a trusting relationship. These children have fears.
You're twice as likely to develop depression. You're probably 3 times as likely to develop some type of anxiety disorder.
As they move into school age, they may have very, very serious behavior problems. As we look at adolescence, we see children running away. Sometimes children may be involved in the juvenile justice system, which puts the child at risk for being an adult offender. And so the cost of violence is staggering.
I felt isolated. Nobody knew what I was going through. To go 3 years without talking about it, I imploded.
Finally, after stressing and keeping everything bottled up and everything building up, I just finally broke down one day and attempted suicide.
Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death
children and adolescents in this country. We always ask in every case, what role might child abuse have played?
My mother, she knew that stuff was going on, but it just seemed like she didn't really care. She never stopped that abuse. And to this day, I've never forgotten what some of my family members have done to me.
These are traumatized kids. And so how do we then, as adults, professionals, caregivers, put a system around children that really is trauma-informed?
Happy feeling. Good job. Okay?
What do we do differently to help rewire their brain? And then ultimately, how do we build capacity in order to really help our kids?
Everybody come together, whether it's in the community, in the home, in the school, wherever children are, and child by child, think of ways in which we can intervene early and educate people about what children need in order to grow, to thrive, and to continue to be resilient human beings.
Okay, so a hard video to watch, and I think that the thing why we wanted to start with this video is because so many of the youth that you see in your schools presenting with mental health crisis more than likely have some type of traumatic event. I think the young man in the video said it most. He held on to everything until he imploded. And a lot of times when it comes to mental health crisis, that's what we're seeing with youth is that implosion from holding on to so much for so long. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again.
And agreed with that. We did want to lead with that because trauma is not something that you can always see, right? So you're seeing big externalizing behaviors or withdrawn, depressive, or anxious behaviors, or sudden changes in their grades or their socialization. And that's the presenting that we see in terms of crisis. But underlying that, it is trauma in so many cases. And in fact, 2/3 of all students have experienced at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. And as you might have heard in the video just now, the director of the trauma center said most of the youth that they see have at least 4 traumas. So trauma upon trauma with compounded trauma. So I'm not gonna read you the list of what a trauma can be, but it also is pretty expansive in terms of trauma. And for youth who don't have a lot of protective factors, that is really gonna impact them potentially differently than youth that have some protective factors. And every youth then is going to present to you in the classroom and in your schools a little bit differently. So we really did want to spend some time talking about trauma as kind of a foundation to keep in mind when you're working with the youth.
So I'm going to give a little overview of the brain. Some of you could probably know the brain better than I do in this presentation, but just it's so important because, again, when you're seeing youth in crisis, what's happening in their brain is very important, I think, for us as professionals to understand so that we can help intervene better. So, of course, we have the prefrontal cortex, right? That's our logical, that's our thinking brain. Doesn't fully develop until we're around 25, 26 years of age. That allows us to be less impulsive, slow down, think through things. So when we're talking about children and adolescents, that prefrontal cortex has not developed yet. And so their ability to think through things and not be as impulsive, it's just not there. So when they're presented with a situation that is scary for them, and scary can be anything. I go back to the mobile crisis definition of crisis, and that is crisis can be defined by the youth and the family. And I think scary can be defined by the youth. Whatever they're experiencing, that causes their alarm system to get set off, right? And being scared, it's an automatic emotional response to a situation. We can't control that feeling of being scared when it initially happens. It's something that our body kicks into an automatic response in trying to protect itself. And so really that emotional response hijacks our frontal lobe, our rational part of the brain, and it turns on our survival mode, our primitive brain, which is the amygdala. The amygdala is like our little alarm. It's a bell that goes ding, ding, ding. You're scared, do something quick. Don't think, just do it. And the primitive brain only has 3 options: fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm sure you've all heard of those before. And it really is very prevalent in youth in crisis, because once that amygdala is set off, youth are going to do one of these 3 things. They're either going to fight, they're going to flee, or they're going to freeze. And it can look different in everyone. And I think if we all look at ourselves and what our emotional response is to being scared, you would probably be able to identify which one of these 3 kicks in for you. For me, I'm a fleer. If I'm presented with something scared, and I'm turning around and running as fast as I can. But for someone else, they might walk into the danger. And that's that fight piece. And then for someone else, they might just totally shut down and freeze. And that's their body's way of protecting them from whatever threat they feel is in front of them. And then we also have our wonderful little hippocampus, which is like our library in our brain, and it stores all of our memories. Our hippocampus is amazing. However, it doesn't store our memories in chronological order. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens to youth when they're triggered and it sets off a mental health crisis. It's because our hippocampus just pulls up a memory from anywhere and says, this has happened before. It feels like it's happening now, right? And then it causes that amygdala to continue to go off. So yeah, Anne, you want to talk a little bit about what fight looks like?
Sure. So this can often be what I look like when faced in a situation where I have to choose fight, flight, or freeze. So in our youth and adolescents, what you might see in a situation is that they'll fight back, that they become defiant. You ask them in a classroom to sit down and you see oppositional, you see that they throw something or punch something. They want to argue with you. You may see them later out on the playground or in the hallways, engaging in some maybe bullying activity or some conflictual activity with their peers, because they have been triggered then to fight, to protect themselves. That's their protective measure for themselves, is to put up that wall of I will fight before you can get to me. And so a lot of our youth are presenting like that. And a lot of the calls that we get in mobile crisis are these youth, right? Because their externalizing behaviors are big and they're easier to see. And our externalizing youth get identified sooner because they also sometimes then cause a threat to others, right? Not just themselves in these situations.
My favorite example of fight, I always think of this, Dana loves it when I tell this, is the movie, I hope you've all seen The Breakfast Club, right? And if you guys remember the rebel kid on there, and the detention teacher is telling him to stop doing something. And this is a kid who goes into fight mode when he feels threatened or scared, right? And especially embarrassed in front of his peers, which is what was happening in that scene. And the detention teacher tells him, stop doing what you're doing or you're going to get another weekend of detention. And the rebel kid says, so, right? That's his fight kicking in. So do it. And so the detention center says, okay, you just earned yourself another weekend. The rebel kid says, okay, I don't care, right? That's his fight in there. That's him protecting himself from what he perceives as a threat. So I just think that's a good example of fight, at least for me, if you're an 80s movie freak.
And one of the things, when you encounter a youth in this situation where they're in fight mode, and it's particularly like Michelle was describing from Breakfast Club, giving that youth, I'll just give a tip here, some space to save face, right? Because by the time that they have dug in, now their peers are watching, and they can give in and lose, but someone in fight mode is not going to want to lose, right? So allowing that youth to separate from their peers, to step out of that situation, to be alone or to be with some trusting adults is really important sometimes with these youth that are in fight mode, because they will not back down in front of their peers.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Anne, and I think we're going to emphasize it several times during this presentation about that's a wonderful tip to use with a youth who's in a mental health crisis and in fight mode. Are you taking flight or am I, Anne?
I think you are.
Oh, okay, all right. So flight, when we see a youth who amygdala is going off because they feel some type of threat, it's triggered a response in them where they feel they need to protect themselves, and their emotional response is flight. These are the kids that present as like a bird stuck in a cage. And when I say that, it's like you can picture like a bird in distress, right, in this small cage and just flapping its wings and trying to get out, but feeling stuck. These can be the kids that present in your classroom as annoying, irritating. They have personal space issues, inability to regulate emotions, very dramatic, trying to get that attention on them to get out, to protect themselves, to get noticed. They can be very sensitive, even the smallest little thing of, maybe they're in flight mode and they raise their hand and ask to go to the bathroom and they're told, no, you need to wait 5 minutes. That could just totally set them off right there. Again, just that flapping bird in that cage. Very hypervigilant, and what we mean by that is very attuned to everything that's going on around them. Small noises, the kid who's tapping his pencil in the seat next to him, the girl who's shaking her leg in the seat off to the side. I mean, just very aware of their surroundings. Poor impulse control, and very restless. And that's kind of what flight looks like. It's that need to run and flee, right? And so when I said, this is my way of responding to emotional distress, yeah, that's what I want to do. I just want to run. I want to get out, but you're stuck. And it's an awful feeling. And yeah, I like this picture of the girl screaming on the plane, right? Because that's similar to, right, that bird being stuck in a cage. She's definitely in a situation where something's going on and she feels stuck. And she is, because she's on a plane in a seat, right?
And then the third thing that you might see from your children and adolescents in school would be freeze. And these are the youth where it is taking everything they have to contain themselves and their reaction for safety. So what you might see are kids who are internalizing, the ones who look like they can't interact with their peers, or they have awkward social skills, or don't really know how to engage in a peer group at lunch or on the playground. These might be the ones who don't want to come to school. And the young ones, they may be the ones where parents are dropping off and then running really quick because the child, they've had to peel them off of their body, right, to get them into school every morning. They will be drawn more to adults than to peers. They may be present as if they don't have friends, or they're very people pleasing. They want people to like them. They don't want to ruffle any feathers. And again, a lot of that is it's taking everything they have to contain themselves. And so they present as frozen and passive. And these are the youth that I think get overlooked the most in the middle of a crisis, because they're quiet. Well, with the exception of the youth that is peeled off their parent first thing in the morning, right, with the school refusal, but they're quiet. They'll sit and do their work or not do their work, but they're not causing any problems in the classroom or in the school community. So I see those as being the youth that we need to maybe pay particular attention to, because they don't bring attention to themselves.
Yeah, and I think too with the freeze, I think of youth that has done something and maybe has gotten called down to the principal's office, and the principal is asking, why did you do that? Or what happened? And the youth says, I don't know, and just keeps saying, I don't know. And it can feel very irritating to us as adults, right? But those are the youth that are more than likely, their amygdala has been set off, even the fear of maybe coming down to the principal's office or being caught, and they go into that freeze mode of I don't know. And so again, using some of the tips that we're going to be presenting here to help get them out of that freeze mode, where they're then more able to answer questions and talk with you.
So we know that kids are different than adults. They're not just little adults, right? And Michelle touched on a lot of this already, but this is really important in that the frontal lobe is the last part of our brains to develop. It's why adolescents are so risk-taking in their behavior, because they do not have a fully developed brain. And that doesn't even happen until they're out of college, which is kind of newish, right? We knew it happened in the early 20s, but now it really is 24, 25, where their brain is not fully developed. It means they're not rational. So when you ask them why, they probably honestly do not know why. And as a grown adult, that's super frustrating, like Michelle just said, right? Super frustrating to ask, why did you hit your friend? They maybe really do not know. It may be really an impulsive behavior. Children and adolescents communicate in their bodies and in their behaviors more than in their words. So, for those of us who have been teaching our kids I statements and talk about your feelings and all of those things since they were born, because they were unfortunate enough to be born to LCSWs, right? And that's what we do to our children when you're a therapist, is we start teaching feelings. They may have the words, but it may not be totally connecting because biologically, it's not all yet connected. And so that really is our take-home message for you on the brain and how it operates, is that it's unpredictable, right? Because they're unpredictable. So it's spotty, and they may talk a good game and all of that, but when it comes down to it, their self-control and their ability to self-control is impacted by brain development. It's impacted by their peers, right? They're highly influenced by that peer group and who they're with in the environment. So all things to take into consideration when you have a youth in crisis in your classroom or in your school, and you're engaging with them initially in the middle of a crisis. So that all of those factors are really going to have an impact on what you're seeing with that youth.
Yeah, and just a quick example of how kids feel their feelings in their body. We had a mobile crisis call recently of a 10-year-old youth, and had just in the last 6 months began exhibiting these behaviors of just screaming, tantruming, refusal to go to school, threatening to kill members of his family with no plan or intent. But this was a youth who was just showing us that something was going on. And during the mobile crisis intervention, we found out mom had had a traumatic experience. The other caretaker in the house wasn't doing well. They had lost their jobs. They were getting ready to be evicted. And so what we saw this amazing 10-year-old youth doing was showing us that my family is on the verge of destruction and we need help. And the adults in the family couldn't ask for help. They weren't able to, right? So this little 10-year-old showed us, my family needs help. And it was amazing. Once we were able to heal and intervene in that environment, guess what? Those crisis behaviors that youth was showing, they went away pretty quickly. So that's just an example of how youth are different from adults and showing their feelings with their bodies.
You can go on to the next one, Michelle. I got this. You can skip this one.
You don't.
Yeah, I talked about it already.
Oh, you did talk about it already. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing too, before we move away from the fight, flight, or freeze and that emotional response is somebody who, a youth who has experienced some type of trauma. It's important to know that they can be in that emotional response, that fight, flight, or freeze consistently, never going out of it. And I mean, you can imagine what that does to a young person's body who is constantly in that heightened level of arousal, just trying to protect themselves. Or we could see that they might not be in that constant arousal all the time, but something triggers it and they go into that arousal. So there's a couple different ways that youth can maintain that emotional distress.
Well, and they said that in the video too. One of the gentlemen in the video said untreated trauma lives in the body of the child or adolescent, right? So again, what you just described is very, very important. Okay, COVID-19. I hope that everybody is not COVID-19'd out while I start talking about COVID-19 and the impact that it had on mental health for our children and adolescents. As most of you probably heard, in October of 2021, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association all came together and made a joint statement and declaration declaring a national emergency in children's mental health. And so for those of us that work in children's mental health and those of us that work in the schools, this was not a surprise to any of us. We saw this very early on in the pandemic that our children and adolescents were going to be impacted and were being impacted on the mental health front because of the pandemic. It just took a long time to get there because the other needs were so heightened, right? The safety and the health needs, the physical health needs, and getting the COVID under control. So in Nevada specific, what that meant for us is Nevada was already a system that had insufficient resources to meet the basic behavioral health and mental health needs of our children, youth, and adolescents. We don't have enough mental health providers in the state. We have been ranked 51st in mental health services for the past 5 years, and we weren't doing all that fabulous when we weren't 51st, right? So it wasn't like we were 14th and then 51st. We've always been really struggling to meet the needs of our children and adolescents in the mental health arena. In 2018 and 19, there was a national survey of children's health, and it ranks Nevada as 50th, with less than 40% of children between the ages of 3 and 17 obtaining the counseling and mental health services that they needed. So these are the children now that you guys are seeing in your schools as well, right? That we do not have the resources or haven't identified as needing or getting the help that they need. During COVID, we saw something in emergency room visits that had shifted. So when mobile crisis came into play in 2014, it came into play and started as a program because of the emergency departments yelling basically and saying emergency departments are not a place for mental health treatment for our children and adolescents. And they were seeing lots and lots of kids coming in with a mental health crises, and for lack of a better term, clogging up their emergency departments, right? So kids that were coming in with a medical emergency, with a diabetic emergency, with a broken arm, were unable to get treated or had delays in treatment because the hospital beds were filled with children that were there because of a mental health or a behavioral health crisis. So we brought mobile in, and over time, we were able to start to decrease the amount of children and adolescents that were sent to the emergency department for that, because we were intervening in homes, in schools, and in the community. During COVID, however, what we saw was overall in the country that emergency room visits for mental health increased for children ages 5 to 11. And that was huge because we were not seeing that age group in such high numbers prior to COVID accessing emergency departments. Why? Because they were in your schools, right? So you guys were seeing them in schools. We were seeing them in the community, and you were identifying them. And when school then was out of the equation, or online school became the thing, they weren't going to the counselors. They weren't being seen and touched by the teachers for interventions, and they were now headed to the emergency departments. We saw an increase, a marked increase actually for adolescents, where we had seen a decrease, especially in Nevada. And then emergency department visits for suspected suicides attempts increased 51% in adolescent girls in early 2021 compared to 2019. And a lot of the data that we have is 2019 compared to years in the pandemic. So that's why you have that year. So we saw a lot more activity and a lot more treatment being sought in the emergency departments.
Well, and I know too, Anne, I don't know if this is a good time to add it in, but for mobile crisis in Nevada, one of the things that we saw as an impact of COVID, we definitely saw a decrease in schools reporting in and an increase in parents and caregivers calling in for services, which is awesome. But what we were seeing for youth is more lethal suicidal ideation thoughts. So where prior to COVID, we might have an occasional wanting, thinking of killing themselves with a gun or by hanging. It was more of like overdosing or, cutting wrists. And now what we saw during COVID, was those times of when youth were thinking of the hanging, the jumping in front of cars, the jumping off of bridges. I mean, it seemed like just a lot more violent, lethal means of wanting to kill themselves was happening. I didn't say that very eloquently, sorry. I was losing my words.
That is for sure. The intensity of what we saw, especially early on, when youth and families were calling into mobile, was just what Michelle described. It was very intense. The severity was markedly bigger than we had seen prior. I think it has leveled out again though, Michelle, over time. Have you seen that in the data as well?
Yes, okay. It has.
So that's good news. Other good news, and I don't have a slide on it, but I did talk with the Office of Suicide Prevention a few weeks ago, and we did see a decrease in deaths by suicide in our children and adolescents in 2019 and 2020. I believe, I'm not sure I have 21 data yet. What we did see, however, was younger youth dying by suicide that we hadn't seen before. And I want to say it was in 2020 that we had 2 8-year-olds and a 9-year-old. Don't quote me on that exactly. I have the data, I just didn't pull it up for today. Our youth got younger. So yep. While we decreased, Dana, do you know the numbers better than I do?
Yep, we had 2 8-year-olds.
And that was in 2020, correct?
It's in 2021.
21. So we're making strides, but we still have lots of work to do.
Yeah, and it goes along with the slide that we just saw that Anne was talking about, that increase in emergency department visits for that age of 5 to 11-year-olds in mental health crisis, right?
Children and adolescents were particularly vulnerable and hard hit by COVID. We've talked about how they're particularly vulnerable to their environments. And Michelle gave an example of that. That was very evident during COVID of the environments, right? Parents losing jobs, change in routine, change in structure. And I'm probably jumping ahead to my slides, so I apologize in advance. But they were particularly hard hit because they're still developing in all those areas, right? Socially, emotionally, their cognitive, their brain, neurological development is all still very much influenced by everything going around them and all of their situations and all of their experiences. So during COVID, all of that changed, run its head, right? So youth had a lot of negative impacts because of COVID. And I'm not telling you anything you guys don't already know, right? The change in routine, parents were gone all day and now they're home all day. 5-year-olds were having to do online school. 7-year-olds had to change platforms. I had a staff member that had an elementary school student who was talking about how different subjects had different platforms, right? So her core subjects had this platform, but then she'd go to art or music or whatever, and she'd have to change platforms. How do you do that when you're 9? It was really difficult. We in early childhood mental health services used our day treatment staff during the first part of COVID, so that the end of that first year and the beginning of the next year, to go into homes and help caregivers set up schools, right? How do you set up a learning environment for your child for it to be conducive for them? Parents didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to do that. And I had a high schooler, right? So how do you support families and children in doing that? We all know about the isolation and the loneliness that came with it. You couldn't see your friends. And if you were a senior in 2020 or 2021, you lost everything that was a coming of age milestone for you, right? You didn't get your graduation. You didn't get to go to prom. You might have lost your senior year of eligibility in sports. For example, you missed out on your plays. All of those things that people who had worked for their whole childhood life to achieve, they lost. And so there was a grief and loss issue in that. Their relationships with caregiving adults changed. For some of our youth, home is not the safest environment for them. And school was, and there was a teacher or a counselor or somebody that they were connected to, their bus driver. They lost that connection during that time. And for some youth, they didn't have access to internet, or they had too much access to internet. And so we saw an increase in bullying online and things happening on the internet that we hadn't seen quite to the level that we saw before. So lots of things happened to impact our youth and families during that time.
And I know, like from a program perspective, a Safe Voice, because we partner with them closely, and then Mobile Crisis. One of the things that we saw, reports and calls coming in of youth who were Googling ways of how to kill themselves or how they could die. And because they were all online and with their Chromebooks, this information was accessible then to school staff, who then are able to make a report and follow up. It allowed us to intervene with youth quickly who were actually in a mental health crisis, but it also did clog up some of the system as well for those youth who might have simply been doing a research report or something, or a speech and debate article on, youth and suicide or something. So that was just an interesting trend that we saw both in Safe Voice and Mobile Crisis during the homeschooling period of the pandemic.
And here are just, some more examples of environments, right? We lost that connectedness. So every Sunday you had family dinner with grandparents, for example, and that no longer was happening. We talked about the social activities and milestones, but we had lots of youth that lost a parent or a caregiver to COVID-19. So 1 in every 316 children in Nevada lost a parent. And this is old data. I heard yesterday, this is February data, and there's more current data, which I think increases the numbers of children that lost a parent or a caregiver during COVID, to COVID. And 5 million children worldwide lost a parent or a caregiver and were impacted by COVID. So huge, huge loss in terms of death, in terms of peer groups and events and milestones. And so when we go back to a traumatic event, not going to prom is not a traumatic event, but it definitely is something that may cause a grief and loss response, right? It did with my kids. I had a son who was a senior in college and lost his senior year of eligibility in the sport that he had played for 19 years because he was in Southern California and they didn't open back up for his senior year, right? So he lost that. there was a lot of grief and loss for him in that. In fact, he still a year later is talking about how he didn't get that closure of working for this his whole life, and it was just over, right? So not a huge trauma in the sense of a ranking of a trauma, but definitely an impact on our youth and adolescents. And then when you have those impacts that layer on top of each other, and with 2/3 of them already having a trauma, now you've got all this compounded stuff. And then we open up the schools again, right? So 1.5 years of all of this stuff happening and adjusting to figuring out what that is. Now we are back in school full-time 1.5 years later, right? And so I know that the schools are seeing a lot of big behaviors, and it makes sense if you think about what our children, adolescents, and families have gone through, and parents are back at work again, potentially, or not potentially, right? And so that's all having an impact on them now as well.
Well, and I think another thing having an impact too, I think the girl in the video said it best, how she had described that she had lost a friend and she had lost a parent, and she kept feeling, when am I going to be next? And I think we're seeing that in a lot of our youth during the pandemic as well, is they see people dying, they have loved ones that are dying, and that fear for them, if I get this COVID-19, am I going to die? Am I next? So we have youth that are already in that heightened emotional distressed state. And then we see something that might trigger it to go to that next step of fight, flight, or freeze. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we can account for the higher increase in the mental health crisis and mental health symptoms that we're seeing in our youth, is that fear. Am I next? Could I be next, right?
So since the onset of the pandemic, all the things that we have been talking about have really then settled in our children and adolescents with some increase in mental health diagnoses, right? So a lot of youth developed symptoms of depression and anxiety during this time. Makes sense with all of the loss and the changes. We saw that youth that were already suffering from severe emotional disturbances had an exacerbation in their symptoms during this time. We saw that globally, the prevalence of significant generalized anxiety in children and adolescents increased from 12% pre-pandemic to 21%, so almost doubled during the pandemic, the numbers of children and adolescents that presenting with diagnosable generalized anxiety disorder. The prevalence of depression during this time went from 13% pre-pandemic to 25%. So again, almost doubled in our children and adolescents, clinically significant depression in that population. And then for youth and adolescents with depression and anxiety in some longitudinal studies, if you can call them that, over the past couple of years. But what we're seeing is that when we are checking in with those youth now, they're continuing to sustain or continuing to experience some depression and anxiety symptoms, which tells us that the longer that this pandemic goes on, we're seeing a correlation in depression and anxiety. Right? And while we're talking about coming out of the pandemic, it's important to remember that this still carries on, that the depression and anxiety is still there, and that depression and anxiety in our youth and adolescents can present in such a variety of ways. And it can look like all of those things that we talked about earlier with the flight, freeze, or flight, right? You can see the externalizing, you can see the internalizing. So I think we still have a long way to go to get out of this mental health crisis that we're seeing with our children and adolescents as a result of COVID-19. So thank you for hearing about COVID-19 again. Oh, we have one more. Sorry about that. Okay, so what you might see in the classroom, like I was saying, is all those things that we've talked about. Agitation and anger are symptoms of anxiety and depression in children and adolescents, right? So it's not just sitting in the corner crying, those youth, you're going to see a lot of that agitation, anger, irritability, restlessness, difficulty engaging with your peers. You may see youth that are coming in with stomach aches or headaches, or you might have a 7-year-old who needs to go to the nurse every day for a physical symptom. You might have youth that just want to make people happy, like we talked about with those youth that freeze, right? You may have children and adolescents that are withdrawn, or that one day are really engaged in class and the next day are angry and agitated, and then the next day are having stomach aches. And most recently, we've seen a lot on the news, or I've seen a lot on the news, not being in the schools, about violence in the schools, violence towards each other with our children and adolescents, violence towards teachers, violence towards peer groups in their school and in other schools. So a lot of an increase in the externalizing violent behaviors, at least on the news. But you guys are living that, so you can tell me.
And
yeah,
we do have a question in the chat, and I think you'll be getting to this, but I want to make sure that you and Michelle see it. The question is, another pandemic or some other societal disruption could happen again. What could be done to be proactive? Would it help to teach resiliency, or to have things in place that can help with coping in the moment instead of being reactive? Can there be a call to service or ideas for strengthening youth to better withstand whatever might come next? What can be done to teach coping skills and resiliency?
Cool.
Oh, spot on. Wonderful question. Yes. And this is what I know many of us on this call, Ann and I, Dana, Jen, we are constantly striving for those early intervention, preventative, psychoeducation. One of the wonderful things that I think has come out of the COVID pandemic is we're talking more about mental health, and we're talking earlier about mental health. And so I think you make a great point. Our state right now is doing some amazing and innovative planning to bring early services to youth, families, and adults before that crisis hits. So yes, I think teaching in schools, I could go on, look, I'm passionate, I'm on a soapbox. I think teaching in schools, teaching kids how to breathe, when they're stressed out, how to handle, those really intense emotions, teaching them, what emotions are, making grounding and meditation part of the curriculum that we teach our kids, so that when they do hit distressing situations, such as a pandemic, that they have some tools in their toolbox that they can say, this doesn't feel good. I'm feeling tightness in my chest. I remember in class how to use my breathing belly and help calm those feelings down. So yeah, I don't know what Ann has to say about that. And I'm sure all you guys, agree with that. But yes, oh my gosh, we need to be teaching earlier.
And I'm really hoping that, with the influx of funding and programming that has come into the state, that we can shift to a more preventative model. What tends to happen, I've seen with funding, is that it is on that back end reactive space. One of the beautiful things about mobile is that it is an upstream intervention. And by being able to define the crisis as you see the crisis, allows for intervention to happen much earlier than what is typical intervention after the escalation of a mental health problem, right? Prevention is not always funded. So I am really, really hopeful that with the ARPA funding and all the other funding that has come in, I don't know what the districts are doing with it or where it's all been funded, that things that Michelle just talked about in terms of mindfulness and meditation and coping skills and activities for youth who might not be able to otherwise engage in it because of financial restrictions or other reasons, that we can get our children and adolescents more tools and more skills, and give tools and skills to our teachers and our school staff too, right? Because they need to be able to have outlets and supports and a toolbox as well for our increasingly difficult presentations that are happening in the district. So that is a great question.
Yeah, well, and working closely, we with Mobile Crisis work closely with the Nevada Department of Education. Some amazing things that are already happening, is the Office of Safe and Respectful Learning. That is an amazing, agency in our state. How we're building the mental health services in our schools, the social workers, the licensed clinicians in the schools. I think that's a huge step in those education and pre-preventative measures that we're taking as a state. So we just need to keep building off that. Oh, this was one of Dana's slides in her presentation. Okay, so phases of a crisis. Really important to be aware when you're encountering a youth who is in a mental health crisis. It starts usually with that trigger, which we've talked about a lot, and that trigger can be something as simple. If you have a youth that is walking down the hall between class periods and another kid bumps him or shoves him, if that's a youth who is already having emotional dysregulation, that could be enough of a trigger to send that youth into a crisis situation, right? They automatically start thinking, oh, did he do that on purpose? Did anybody else see him do that? Man, should I go back and bump him back, man? And then the thoughts just start rolling and rolling and rolling, and that's where you see that build-up period. I'm using a very simple example for this. Until he's thinking, I'm gonna go kick that kid's butt. I'm going after him. He bumped into me. He made me look stupid in the hallway. And that's where you're seeing that blow up, that he goes running down the hall after the kid. And then thankfully there's a teacher there, and the teacher is able to intervene, slow the kid down, bring him into the classroom, and then work on that calm down period until that youth is back to a calm state. What's really important in this example, do not attempt logical or problem-solving interventions during a blow-up. And also important not to talk about consequences during that stage of a mental health crisis that's a blow-up. Really, when a kid is at that heightened of a crisis, the best thing that you can do, just be there, be calm. We'll go over some tips in just a little bit, but it's really waiting for them to get out of that blow-up period and back down to that area of where they're starting to calm, that then you can start with those logical solutions, problem solving, and eventually when they're to that calm period, talk about any consequences.
So I think we've talked about this throughout the presentation, but just wanted to throw up again some thoughts and some physical things that you may see with a child or adolescent who's presenting in crisis. You can skip, Michelle, to the next one. For those of you working with very young children or preschool age children, you might see that fear of separation, a change in them crying or screaming a lot. You might see changes in how they're eating. They may be losing weight. They may be coming in and talking about having nightmares. If you have them, well, you wouldn't have them doing naps at school, I suppose, but they may come in and talk about nightmares, difficulty sleeping. And I know when I don't sleep, I function a little bit differently the next day. I might react differently or quicker than I would if I had slept well the night before. So sleep is it's pretty important. In our elementary school youth, Michelle, if you bump it. You might see differences in fears or anxiety, expressions of guilt or shame when they're talking or writing or turning in assignments. You may see that. You may see differences or changes in their ability to concentrate, right? So you might have had a student who was doing just fine, but now is hypervigilant, like Michelle was talking about earlier, and paying attention and reacting to everything in the classroom. And again, that sleep difficulty we see a lot in elementary school as well. And then in our middle and high school youth, we start to see, depression, anxiety, as we've talked about, could be some eating disorders, some self-harming behaviors. Middle and high school is where we start seeing youth using alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism, and may become involved in risky sexual behavior. And if you look at some of those on the middle and high school, and you think about the underdeveloped brain or the not quite developed impulse part of their brain and the risk-taking behaviors, this is where you really start to see the risk-taking behaviors come into play, is when they're in middle and high school. And that can be pretty dangerous. So what do you do? So you have these kids, now you know what you're going to see in kids potentially when they're in your schools, and what do you do? There is power in just being present. So Bessel van der Kolk, who has done a ton of work on trauma and trauma in the body, says human connection is our greatest antidote to grief and or trauma, human connection. So you've got a student in your classroom that is struggling. You may not know the right words or how to assess for suicidality, or has this child had a trauma, and that is okay. Because what is really important as an adult in a situation where a youth is in crisis is being present, ensuring their safety, right? Making sure that they know that they're safe, that you can keep them safe from themselves, from others, right? So sometimes when you're in crisis, that's what you need. You need to be in an environment where somebody can hold you, not literally hold you, but hold the space in a safe way, and be in control, because you're not, right? So whether you're in fight, flight, or freeze, when you're in crisis, you lose that sense of being in control of the situation. And so to have an adult who is saying, I will keep you safe, is super important. To make that human connection with them, and to say things, to be there and to care about them and to let them know that you're there is enough sometimes. And then to help them regulate their emotions. And that doesn't have to be a whole toolbox of things. It can be as simple as breathing with them, right? I was telling Michelle yesterday, I got a call from a LCSW doing some clinical consultation, and she had a youth that was very much in crisis and was grunting and yelling, and the foster care parent was trying to transport them to an appointment with a therapist. And while this child could not regulate his emotions and was not going to be responsive to any intervention that was going to happen at that time, what the LCSW did was breathe and work through a breathing exercise with the foster parent over speakerphone that child then listened to as well. And so they were regulating emotions and regulating the environment, probably for the foster parent who needed it as well, and the LCSW who was a little bit anxious about what was happening, and the child. So just providing a safe, comforting environment while you engage somebody who can do a more in-depth mental health assessment in a lot of situations is enough. That can be enough.
Yeah, and what Anne beautifully described is that that graph that we saw, right? She just described a youth who was in that blow-up stage, and a very simple intervention of breathing that then got that youth down to that calmer stage, to where then an intervention could happen. So.
Is this you or me, Michelle?
Go for it, Anne.
Okay. So again, when you have a youth in crisis, be confident, be calm, let them know that you are in control, not controlling, but in control, and build that feeling of safety for that youth. Easier said than done, but don't escalate with that youth, right? So the steadier you can stay as the youth is moving through that peak and valley of their emotional response to the situation, or their behavioral and emotional response to that situation, the steadier you can stay, the better off it's going to be, right? Because when, if you get in a fight with your partner or your child and you both go, it doesn't usually end well, right? when you escalate at the same time. We talked about giving a youth physical space to de-escalate, physical space away from their peers to save face, or to not lose credibility with their peers, both very important, right? So if you're in a room with a youth, don't feel like you have to be too close to them, like allow them to pace. Our agitated youth might want to walk back and forth. They may need to go for a walk around the hallways or out into the yard or something, because movement is going to sometimes help release some of that energy that is creating to that spike in the crisis. It's important to throw in some positive comments, right? And some empathy. I know you're upset that this happened. I know you're angry that this happened. It looks like you are really sad about what was said to you in the classroom. I appreciate that you're talking to me at this time, or, those kinds of things. So really acknowledge where they're at, what you're seeing behaviorally, or attempt to place an emotion on what you think they might be feeling. I'll tell you that if you get the emotion wrong, they're going to tell you, I'm not mad. I am whatever, right? Or I'm not sad. I am so mad that they said that because, okay, all the time. I get corrected in therapy all the time by youth if I get it wrong. So they will tell you if you get it wrong.
Well, and I see on this,
No.
this is, oh my gosh, what was I going to say? This is where you want to tell a youth what they're doing right. And again, we're talking, they're in this blow up stage, right? So these are tips for when they're in that blow up stage and we're trying to get them to calm down. So focus on what they're doing well and not what they're doing wrong. And so just like Ann said, saying, you're doing a great job of talking to me in a calm voice, or you're doing a great job of just breathing. And so just anything you can do, that positive reinforcement to get them out of that blow up phase.
So, and again, acknowledge when they're that what they're doing well, the signs of de-escalation, empathize with them. And then if you need to give instructions, make sure that they're simple, one-step kind of instructions. For those of you that have children, when you say, I need you to, pick up your shoes, take them upstairs, clean up your closet, and then come back down and take a shower, that you're going to get like to the shoes. And that's probably all you're going to get. Same with a youth in crisis, right? One step at a time, then circle back, acknowledge the work that they've done, continue to provide that safety and that connectedness, and then move on to the next instruction. And for some of our youth, you are going to have to give instructions, right? You're going to want them to get to the front office. You're going to want them to put down the scissors. So it will be important to know that you may have to give instructions and to keep them very simple and doable.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Dana and I teach when we do the critical incident training for law enforcement and first responders is taking that walk with a youth if possible. So if you have a youth in crisis in your classroom, if you can get them to a school social worker, if you can get them to a school counselor, someone that has that time that could go take a walk with them, get them outside, some fresh air. That's one of the best things that you can do to get from that blow up stage down to a little bit calmer. And of course you want to do it, you want to feel safe in doing it too. But if that is an option, that's a great tip.
And then just to summarize some of it, when you're talking to a youth in crisis, really assure them that they are safe, that you are a safe person. Make sure that you are a safe person. If you are the person that they're going at in a classroom, you're probably not the safe person, right? And so how do you engage somebody else to come in and support that youth and remove yourself from that? Or if you're not feeling safe and you've been triggered, which happens by some of our youth, it may not be that you're the one to to provide that safety, right? Because you're triggered, and being emotionally available to provide that safety and holding environment for someone when you don't feel yourself safe is, so I'm saying get help, right? In those situations. It's important for children to know that they aren't always responsible for the events and that it's not their fault. And so in that moment, focusing on the fact that they blew up and threw something at somebody because they were triggered is not the time to do that. You can do that later. Patience, super important, right? Not all of our youth are going to recover at the same rate or in the same manner or the same fashion. And you may get them to a calm spot and they may come in the next day and be triggered again, right? And you're right back there and you may be in this cycle, and that's super, super frustrating as the adult in a situation to have this happening repeatedly. It's also really hard, like, what can I do differently? Whatever I'm doing is not working, and to give yourself some grace as well, that you are not responsible for that. And, you know, when you go in to support that youth. And then, like we talked about a little while ago, you don't have to be the one to do the assessment on this youth. It's not your responsibility, well, unless you're the school social worker in this call, in which case it might be, to do that assessment on, or that risk assessment. And I know that is a lot of pressure on the classrooms and the teachers and the school personnel to get it right, to make sure you didn't miss anything. And what I'm saying to you is you don't have to own that. There are people that are trained to do that within your schools. And I know that all the schools look a little bit different, or the districts look different in the state as to who in their schools can do that. And then to engage mobile, which we'll talk about here at the end. But to seek out the help of trained professionals, really important. You do not have to own that assessment piece yourself.
Well, and that's one of the things that we see a lot in mobile crisis, especially with youth who present with suicidal ideations. Let's say they tell a friend at school that they're wanting to kill themselves, and then that friend goes to the school counselor, and then the school counselor is calling that suicidal youth into the counselor's office to talk to them. Right there, I can guarantee you that youth has their amygdala's ringing, and they're in fight, fight, or freeze mode because they're scared. They're very scared of what's going to happen. And we hear from youth all the time in mobile crisis that they're afraid of being in trouble, or they're afraid of telling their parents or what their parents are going to think. One of the biggest things that we hear when it comes to suicidal youth. And I think I worked with so many amazing school social workers and school counselors who, with the help of mobile crisis, the counselor just sits there with that youth and says, I'm here for you. I hear that you're scared. I've got your back. We're going to get through this together, right? And it's just like Anne said, that sense of safety. You don't promise them anything that you can't promise them, right? So don't say, oh, your parents aren't going to be mad, or you aren't going to be in trouble, because you can't guarantee that. But what you can guarantee is that you can sit there with them and you're a safe place, and that you are not going to leave them.
And then we just wanted to give a quick word about manipulation. So often we will hear things like that behavior is manipulative to get this, or that is an attention-seeking behavior, right? We hear that quite a bit. So a couple facts on that is that there's no established method for differentiating manipulation and actual suicide intent. So if a youth is telling you that they're having a suicidal thought, believe them, right? Believe them, and then we will do an assessment and create a safety plan and ensure that youth is safe, because this, although even if the suicidal intent is not like there's no means and it's not realistic, you may have a 7-year-old who is going to shoot themselves, but there's no access to a gun. Doesn't matter. What they're saying to you is, I am hurting, I am in pain, and other things that I've done to relieve this pain is not working. And so here I am at this point, right? There's a a fact here about evidence points to the fact that attempts labeled as manipulative do not differ in lethality or suicidal intent from true attempts to die, right? So important to remember that. It's important to increase supervision, decrease isolation, and engage mental health professionals or school-based crisis teams or the mobile crisis team. When you are hearing a youth talk about suicidal intent, talk about wanting to die, saying things like, I wish I didn't wake up tomorrow, would people miss me if I'm gone? All of those things really important to engage somebody to explore those further. And I challenge everybody here to do a paradigm shift of sorts and to move away from the manipulation or attention seeking and move to a term that I use called connection seeking. Because what I see in our children and adolescents is not a manipulative or attention seeking behavior, but really an attempt to connect with somebody, to connect to feel safe, to connect to get their needs met, to connect to have their feelings heard or to be seen, or to have somebody present. So I challenge everyone to start thinking of it more as a connection and what does this child and adolescent need in this moment versus they're just trying to get my attention, right?
I love that, Anne. Connection seeking. Okay, that's kind of the meat of our presentation. I don't know if there's any other questions in the chat, and then Anne and I just wanted to talk a little bit about resources that are available. If you do experience a mental health crisis in your school and you don't have the staff that are able to handle it, or if you need some more professional intervention. So we can start with mobile crisis. I think the majority of you probably already know what the Children's Mobile Crisis Response Team is. We've talked about it several times during this presentation. I just want to throw it out there. It is 100% a resource that has shown I think we're running at an 86% hospital diversion rate, maybe 84%, statewide of clinicians, teams of case managers that can intervene during a behavioral health crisis. Again, crisis is defined by the youth and the family. Doesn't have to be suicidal, doesn't have to be homicidal, can be anything from anxiety, depression, bullying, parent-child, conflictual relationships, just anything that, as Anne said in the beginning of this presentation, is causing stress and de-stress in that child's life, enough where it affects their day-to-day functioning. And again, back to the effectiveness, the mobile crisis is not just a quick risk or safety assessment. It's not just us doing a Columbia suicide screening. It is a treatment intervention. And what that means is the teams are working diligently to try to help stabilize that youth, safety plan, wrap services around them to prevent unnecessary hospitalization and to get families served in their home communities. So it's definitely a resource to the schools. We do prefer that a parent or guardian or caretaker be present when the school calls mobile crisis. The reason being, again, is because this is a treatment intervention and we need parents' permission in order to treat, even during a crisis situation. There are some situations where crisis intervention can be done without a parent's consent until a parent is contacted, and of course diligently trying to contact that parent or caregiver. But if it is an imminent safety risk for the youth, they can be assessed, and of course, following your school protocol, taken to the hospital or whatever that looks like. So, but mobile crisis is a resource that's out there. It's statewide. It's 24/7. What am I missing, Anne?
If I can jump in on the importance of the parent and caregiver involvement, because we do have that 86% hospital diversion rate, what that means, we only about 14% of the youth end up needing to go into a higher level of care or an acute setting. because we can't keep them safe in the community. So one of Mobile's goal, of course, is to keep children and adolescents safe. It's also a goal of ours to keep them in their communities and in their homes. And in order to do that, we have to have the engagement and the buy-in and support and the work being done by their parent and caregiver, starting at the time of the assessment. So we could have a youth that presents with some suicidal thoughts, and to keep them in the home and have them back in their schools the next day. And we do that by doing the assessment and creating safety plans, right? And the safety plan may include things like locking up guns or providing the family a safe to put medications in as part of that safety response, and keeping that youth from having to go into a hospital, because going into an acute hospital is not like, it's not vacation or Disneyland for a youth, and it can be pretty traumatic for some youth. And if we can avoid that, we try to do that. So we really do want parents, caregivers, schools, when they're involved, to be involved in the creation and the carrying out of the safety plan, so that we can keep them in their homes and in their communities. So can we assess a youth in crisis without parental consent in an emergency? Under state statutes, yes, we can do so. It is most definitely not our preference to do that. We do know that sometimes parents are unreachable. So Michelle, who lives in the rurals, but not Anne, who lives in Las Vegas, will talk about parents who might have a shift in the mines, for example, and can't be reached, right, Michelle? I'm learning. That might be a situation where in an acute moment, we would assess and intervene and then get that parent involved as soon as we could get them involved. Something like that. I see the question that Eric is asking about parents that are not responsive. We don't find that very often in Mobile, to be honest, that we cannot engage a parent. We engage parents, I would say 99% of the time in that initial and getting them involved. It's very, very rare that we do not get. They might not always agree with the outcome, but in terms of getting them involved and consenting and part of that assessment process, we are pretty successful at doing that.
And I think even parents that seem uncooperative at the school level, when that intervention is starting, a lot of times when it hits that crisis period, needing to pull in Mobile Crisis, we find that sometimes those uncooperative or unwilling parents, just like Anne said, they will take a shift to at least understand that there is a treatment intervention needed. And of course, for youth that are absolutely acute and a parent is uncooperative, we call on our partners at DCFS to help. But that's, again, like Anne said, maybe 1% of the time.
The other important reason for having the parent and caregiver involved, in addition to the safety planning and being a part of the treatment, is if you go back to the example that Michelle gave about the 7-year-old, 10-year-old who was telling you about the family crisis through his behavior, without engaging the families in that, you won't get that rich feedback, right? So we don't just do are you suicidal, are you homicidal, and do a checkbox, but it really is a very thorough psychosocial look at what is going on with this family overall, because we know, right, and we've talked about it today, that the environment and all the stressors are going to impact this child. So if we have a family that doesn't have food, for example, and you think about hierarchy of needs, if they don't have food, they're not going to be available as much to attend to their child's emotional needs. So we hook them up with food. We look at, can you pay your rent? If you're looking at getting evicted on the 1st of the month and it's the 29th, that is your crisis as a parent. And your child's emotional crisis you might not be quite as available or able to support that or see it, right? Because you've got this other stuff. So we are looking at all of that, and that's hard to do if you don't have the parent or caregiver engaged in that assessment. And then in the rurals, Michelle is doing this by telehealth with boots on the ground with your case manager. Talk to me, Michelle, about rurals.
Just telehealth. Yeah, we're doing telehealth right now.
But in the urbans, we are doing it in person. So we are seeing those environments when we're responding in the homes too. And so sometimes what parents don't tell us in an assessment, we, in the stabilization phases of the mobile response, will see. So we'll be in a home to do stabilization and a parent will leave the cupboards open and we will see. So they may not be able to tell us for whatever reason that they don't have food, but because we are there and they've invited us into their home to do these stabilization work, we see what is happening in the home and can then support that as well. So I think we didn't talk so much about the stabilization part of the mobile response and stabilization, but in addition to the assessment pieces that we can do up front and ensuring that safety, we can stay involved with this youth and family for 45 to 60 days or so and do some really intensive continued stabilization work. So for those youth who are maybe would check a rubric and might have to go to the hospital, but we can create a safety plan, we can also now be there physically or by telehealth the next day, twice the next day, 5 times this week to provide support. I had a teenager once who's because of mom's shift, the only time she could do family sessions was at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I sent our overnight team out at 6 in the morning into the home to do that stabilization. And then she had some individual work that was done later in the day, for example, to meet some of those needs. So there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of availability to be in that home a lot early on while we connect then to community resources.
Well, and I think that brings up a good point too, Anne. There was a rural school district that in their crisis procedure was to call mobile crisis when they had a student presenting with a behavioral health crisis. And there were licensed clinicians on the school staff as their school social workers. And so I got questions from them often about, we don't understand why we have to call mobile crisis. We can safety plan with the family. We can help de-escalate a crisis situation. And absolutely, there are some school professionals that can do that and are licensed to do that. The benefit of pulling in mobile crisis is that's our specialty, and we have the time to do it because crisis and stabilization, as anybody who's been through one in your schools, it takes a lot of time. And like Anne said, we could be in there twice a day for 5 days a week trying to help stabilize and continue to get this youth and family served in their home community without having to hospitalize for safety. So it just takes a lot of time. So we're like, let us take the work off you so that you guys can continue to focus on the other, school stuff that's going on. So I think it's a nice partnership of really providing, great wraparound services from the school to the community for these youth by utilizing everyone's professional experience in helping the family.
So I have a question, Michelle and Anne. When I was in a school mental health role, I always wanted to ensure that we did have that wraparound feeling and that sense of a warm handoff. So in talking with families, what's the best way to describe to parents and caregivers of what this would look like to bring in mobile crisis response so that they know what to expect and that we would be describing accurately what this process looks like?
Do you want it, Michelle?
Go for it, Anne.
So mobile crisis, when you're talking to a parent, you can talk with them about how mobile crisis will, so I'm gonna talk urban areas, and I'm gonna Michelle talk rural because it looks a little bit different. So in the urban areas, a team is going to respond. A team will come to the family. So we are gonna come out at the family's time and location of choice. So if you have a youth that's kind of lower on the risk factors, maybe presenting with some anxiety, and the family's at work and this youth has a stable place to be until that parent gets home, that parent may say, I cannot leave work. Can you come at 6 o'clock tonight? And we will say, yes, we will. We will come to your house at 6 o'clock tonight, right? We're gonna come as a team. We're gonna send a master's level clinician and a bachelor's level psychiatric caseworker, targeted case manager. And the assessment is going to be both a mental health assessment and a looking at all of the social domain assessment, right, that we talked about, so that we can look at what all those other needs are, what the supports are. And then we're going to do a safety plan at the end of that first time. That could take an hour or two. It has taken half a day sometimes, depending on what the youth is presenting with and if we need to hospitalize. At the end of the assessment, we do have recommendations, right? So for a few youth, we do recommend that they have to be in an acute setting. And if that is our recommendation, then we do that. We call the hospitals, we get them the assessment, we help facilitate and ensure that that youth makes it to an acute setting, if that's what they need. For most of our youth, that's not what they need. And they just need that stabilization or that intensive stabilization. For a lot of our youth and families, this is their first time in the mental health, receiving mental health and behavioral health services. So this is all new to them. So we really work with them on understanding those pieces and then getting them connected over, once we've continued to stabilize, getting them connected. Families can choose not to engage in that as well. So it's very much driven by family choice, by what the family and youth are presenting with in terms of where we go after that initial assessment. But the initial response is really information gathering and safety planning for our youth. That was a lot of words to describe.
That was a very technical answer, Anne. This is how I would respond in the rural areas. I would just encourage you, if you have a youth in crisis, to say to a parent, hey, I'm really worried about the safety of your child, and I think we need to pull in some professional help. There's this amazing program through the state of Nevada, free to you. You will never receive a bill. And they have teams of child mental health experts who can come and see what's going on and see if they can help stabilize the crisis that I'm seeing. And I would just leave it simple. And then I would say, we just need to call this hotline. And once we call this hotline, if you're in the urban areas, a team will be contacting you and will meet you wherever you want to meet. If you're in the rural areas, a clinician will call you within minutes of hanging up from the hotline. So I just keep it really simple and just make it sound like really supportive and like it's kind of like how Anne described earlier about helping a youth feel safe during a crisis. I think how you describe a mobile crisis intervention to a parent that allows them to also feel safe and held and like not physically held, right? The space held for them to where then they're able to, focus on just helping de-escalate the crisis and being part of that safety planning and intervention. So.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Next time Michelle gets to go first on that one.
I did see a question real quick in the thing about, talk a bit about crisis response tips for after school incidents. And I don't know if you want to take this, I can start off. I really think, number one, it's important, don't ignore it. Don't ignore after a crisis. It is so important to have some type of communication with students, staff. I know that there's been times where people have had, or schools have had assemblies. Maybe that's what they choose to do. I know other times schools are setting up mental health professionals around the school and letting students know that there's a safe place to go and talk. I mean, I encourage teachers to, in the classroom, say, hey, I just wanted to check in with everyone and see how everyone's doing. Don't keep it a secret and don't not talk about it. I think that's one of the biggest tips I have.
I would also say, to utilize the two resources that we had up earlier as well and connect them with either the, mobile crisis or Safeways. And then in July, nationwide, we'll be rolling out an emergency phone number for mental health and behavioral health crises. So there's going to be a 3-digit number, 988, which is different than 911 because mental health crises is not a crime, right? So we're not calling to report a crime, but we are calling because we're in crises. So that's going to roll out, and that will be a hotline that is answered and manned 24/7, and will also connect to emergency supports and resources, just like you would if you were calling 911 with a house on fire emergency. So a preview of something to come.
I think it's worth saying, and Michelle's been involved, I think you too, and the 988 youth is still pretty limited on its scope. I mean, they didn't even talk about youth in their initial planning. So I'm glad you're involved, but I also think you guys have established teams that are ready to go. So, you know, them. And for school staff, you know, this Office of Safe and Respectful Learning, we can help too anytime, help connect you to people who can walk you through post-crisis intervention. As a side note, 988 stresses me out.
Just thought I'd throw it out there as a preview of what's coming.
It's very good, and good job.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know if anybody had any other questions. I hope there were some at least little nuggets of information that you could take from Ann and I today. And one of the things that we also wanted to offer, we talked with Jen about, is, you know, we would almost like to do smaller, maybe focus groups regionally to come in, because we would love to hear some of the situations that have happened in your schools or that you've been presented with youth in crisis, and any advice or tips that we can give on actual situations that happened. So just kind of more of that back and forth professionals, you know, trying to figure out how to best get through a mental health crisis with a youth in a school. So maybe we can do that in the future.
Yes, I would love to help to coordinate any additional trainings. I did put a little survey in the chat box, which if you are seeking additional training, there's a place on there that you can give us your contact information so we can coordinate with your LEA. I'm so excited to see, I think we had 7 school districts and the state charter authority here today. And we have teachers, counselors, safe school professionals, social workers, administrators, and school nurses on this call. I want to emphasize that sometimes we find ourselves with a child in crisis when it's maybe not our formal role. And so I really appreciate the hands-on tips that have been provided of what do you say and how do you act when this sometimes falls into our laps as we're lifting up all these children who have struggled quite a bit. So I am so grateful to Ann and Michelle for taking time to plan this training. We've been working to put it together for a couple of months now. It's been a pretty important training, and I just appreciate their time in coming to share with us and willingness to provide additional training moving forward so we can really empower our schools to help these children and families.
And with that, look, we're giving you guys 15 minutes back of your day.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys. Thank you.